I'll be damned if I don't leap with protection next time. All right. Giles, you're coming too. I'll bring a little bit of that. All right, Ziggy, I think we're ready. 3, 2, 1, let's leap.
Quantum Leap.
I've seen Quantum Leap Episode 7, but after this episode, I suppose it might be more apt to say that Quantum Leap Episode 7 has seen you. Don't believe me? Oh, ye of little faith. And assume this to be the last bastion of a spoiler-free existence. Continue forward at your own peril. So this was another wonderfully nostalgic callback to an earlier era of television, something that this show seems to be doing fairly well thus far. It's an episode that brought us back the holiday-themed episode, of which we used to get plenty of back in the day. Sure, there are some sitcoms that still do stuff like this, especially something like The Simpsons, which has been doing it for 30 plus years. But for the most part, that's not something that's been happening in dramas for the most part. And I suppose this is due largely in part to the lack of appointment viewing, the whole scattered nature of binging and streaming and all that crap. But I've always been one to try and track down my holiday favorites to rewatch around that time each year, mainly Halloween and Christmas. And I found these episodes to always be a fun treat when they're sprinkled in during a normal rewatch too. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think this sort of thing should really have never dwindled and should have become a mainstay, and I hope this means we might get more of that in the future. But I suppose now is a good time to actually start by discussing the show you're here for. In a very unconcealed way, this episode attempted to pay homage to both the classic Halloween fare of the original Quantum Leap and the movie The Exorcist. In my opinion, this is the most fun and investment that I've really had in the actual Leap portion of this show since its comeback. That isn't to say that I did not enjoy any of the previous Leap outings, but this is the first time it really felt like the present-day story completely took a back seat to the exploration of the Leap, and that's something I purely enjoyed. Not only was it a fun horror-themed episode, but it was also a mystery. One that may not have been the most complex in the world, but it still provided enough intrigue and twists to warrant a rewatch once everything was solved. Not to mention the guest stars this show is already racking up. Perhaps not the biggest names in Hollywood, but if you're a fan of sci-fi and or superhero shows, you'll find some very familiar faces. And we are nearing the point of needing a Stargate bingo card. As I mentioned, this episode was a fairly on-the-nose reference to The Exorcist, but unlike the latter seasons of Sliders, a show which I do enjoy but was very heavily criticized for the studio mandating they just kind of rip off plots from big movies of the time, this episode took the premise as a basis, but allowed our knowledge as the audience to somewhat fill in some gaps, as well as give us a misdirected interpretation of the story. At least that's how I'm choosing to look at it. For starters, we kick things off with Ben, a man without most of his memory, but he knows enough to realize that he's a man of science and not faith, and he's been thrust into the first steps of an exorcism inside the body of a priest. Side note, I absolutely adored the interaction between Addison and Ben, where he says, "Oh, I don't believe in possessions," only to have Addison reply with, "Ben, you're literally possessing someone right now." That was wonderful. I really liked that little interaction, and that was a complete win for me. And while I'm on the subject, since magic, the character, not the supernatural force, established that people who are leapt into kind of retain the feeling of someone entering their body, and they do have a bit of a memory of the face of who went into them, I'm wondering how that's going to be interpreted by this priest once he returns to his body. Is he going to think that an angel took over his body to banish the demon? I'm kind of intrigued to see where we're going with this. I kind of like this idea of having a Leap to Left Behind group. I still like that idea of them kind of coming together via the internet through a support group, something along those lines. Assuming the show goes on for the long haul, I think that might be an interesting kind of side tangent to look into. Now, after this interaction between Ben and Addison, she is able to give him a very brief rundown on what's going on here, as well as the basic tenets of an exorcism, only to have her ability to connect to him via the imaging chamber just blink out for an unexplained reason. I do like this a lot. It feels like a good excuse to leave him on his own, but it also gives him a way that he does have a little bit of information and he's not completely flailing in the blind. Plus, it really added to the sinister supernatural ambiance of the whole show. Now, with Addison cut off from Ben, we really didn't have much interaction with the present day. We had a couple of nice scenes between Addison and Ian to discuss the problems and to have a little beautiful moment where Ian explains that the paranormal nature of the leap may not really be uncalled for since Dr. Beckett believed that God was actually responsible for the leaping. I cannot overstate just how much I love that they acknowledge this in the show. It may not be a big thing or a big deal for anyone else, but for me it's just another point for this show spending the time to honor the original and further the world of the original in an authentic way. Throughout the course of Ben's dealings with the Gray family and associated member of this demonic house, we get a very Clue-type mystery going on. Each person seems to have a different set of information, backstory, secrets, whatever. So while the main gist of this was the exorcism, it also had a very classic murder mystery feel going on as well, especially after the maid was actually murdered a little later in the story. But I'll come back to this point later on. It was also a nice touch to set this whole thing shortly after the stock market crash leading to the beginning of the Great Depression. So set against the normally mundane talk of inheritance and whatnot, we have a possessed girl upstairs. It was a great mix for me, and there are incredibly paranormal things going on as well. And I'm not just talking about your typical bumps and shadows, but we're seeing full-on apparitions, at least Ben seems to be. Things crawling on the walls, floating bodies, comments from the possessed girl that really did seem like something was up. At one point, Ben is knocked unconscious where he has a somewhat surreal mindscape revelation that puts the pieces together as shown by mental Addison, or could this actually be something or someone else? Another entity entirely. Anyway, the reveal is that part of the family was concocting the scheme together. The girl, Daisy, the one that's being possessed, was going to gain the rights to some inheritance, and the mother, along with the uncle, at least I think he was the uncle, were in love and planning to end the possession with her death and then abscond to Hollywood with the money. Now, with the help of the doctor and Daisy, Ben comes up with a plan to pretend that she died, yet the demon is still within her body, calling out that she was murdered in order to elicit a confession. It works perfectly and the day is saved, although I don't really think I can say that the day was saved because everyone in this situation is pretty much ruined for life, either mentally scarred or to be imprisoned, so while it supposedly ended on a happy note, I can't imagine any of these people are going to have a wonderful life, even if they can put this stuff aside. But coming back to some of the points I alluded to earlier, most of the supernatural apparitions, etc., were drug-induced. However, not all. You see, whilst the whole story was unfolding, it turns out that Janice, we haven't seen in a few episodes, but Janice, Al's daughter, was attempting to break through with her older style quantum leap tech. The black demonish stuff that we saw going on was actually a drug-heightened perception of her incomplete holographic projection. She was actually finally able to materialize at the end of the episode to warn Ben of something, because he actually leaps into his next stop right before she finishes her sentence. Now, she was also responsible for the jammed program that kept Addison out of the entire episode. I'm deeply hoping that means that in the next episode, or very shortly, our team has to travel to the old Quantum Leap facility in New Mexico in order to stop Janice using this older tech. Maybe that's a pipe dream, but oh boy, that would be cool in my opinion. And perhaps this isn't a small point, but I did want to come back to this. It just seems odd to me that the constable who was called after the murder didn't take anyone into custody. I took this to be the first real clue that actual humans were involved in something shady instead of just a supernatural entity. That may just be me thinking too much into it, and it may not actually be a clue. The real clues probably actually started around the first offering of food and drink that was then offered a couple more times throughout the episode, because obviously those were the things laced with drugs that set things into more motion. A few unanswered questions do linger, depending on how literal you may actually want to be. Daisy made a few references to Ben being an angel or being sent from elsewhere. He was a traveler, and that could be taken literally, or perhaps she has more insight into something beyond herself, beyond the normal mundane world. The original show showed us that certain people did have the perception to see the Leaper, people with autism or other developmental issues, I think some animals as well, things like that. It's possible that there was more going on when Ben solved the mystery inside his mindscape. Was it just a subconscious realization, or could someone or something have been giving Ben this information? Was it an angel? Was it God? Was it Sam? I know all of these are kind of creepy when you think of the point that Ben made out with Addison a little bit in his mind. But I don't know. It seemed a little bit more than Ben just piecing things together on his own, which I'm very fine with if that's what they're choosing to go with. But I'm also willing to entertain the fact that maybe there was someone or something else getting involved here. Something that will come back a little later on. Overall, I found this episode to be fantastic. My initial thoughts about the whole possession thing was that it may actually turn out to be one, although not demonic. I was thinking it could be the result of some sort of failed prototype leap from the evil leapers or some other faction. They had not been able to actually perfect the method, and they only partially implanted the leaper into the subject, causing a confused mental battle for control of the body. I'm kind of glad they didn't go with that, but a lot of things pointed to that at the beginning. The whole interference with Addison, possession in general being referenced to what Ben was doing inside this person right now. I just felt like that could have been the way they were going, but I am glad they did it the way they did, because I just found this to be a blast. If you've made it this far and you've not given this show a chance yet, I do urge you to do yourself a favor and give it a try. Let me know all your thoughts about this episode along with any theories or whatever you want down below, and don't forget to kickflip that like button while you're there and leap into that subscribe as well. Until next time, I hope your next leap is a leap home.